At 14:30 on January 8, 1945, Technical Sergeant Russell Dunham crouched in knee-deep snow at the base of Hill 616 near Kaysersberg, France, watching German machine gun fire cut down the winter sky above his pinned platoon. 24 years old, 3 campaigns, 0 plans to die today. The Germans had positioned 3 MG-42 machine guns in timber imp placements up the snow-covered slope, each gun capable of firing 1-200 rounds per minute. Dunham's platoon had been advancing through the Alsace-Lorraine region when they walked into a killing box. Machine gun fire rained down from the hilltop. Artillery shells exploded behind them. The only direction left was straight up a 40-degree slope into converging fields of fire. 11 men from 2nd Platoon had already been killed that week. The snow around their position was churned red. Every soldier in Company I knew the statistics. In the Vosges Mountains campaign, the 3rd Infantry Division had lost more men per day than any other American division in Europe. The Germans held the high ground. They had clear sight lines. They had ammunition. Dunham looked at the hill. His platoon was 35 YD behind him, pressed flat in the snow, unable to move forward or back. If they stayed pinned down, German artillery would bracket their position and kill them all. If they retreated, they'd be cut down in the open. The machine guns had them locked in place. The temperature was 12° F. The snow was 18 in deep. Dunham wore standard olive drab wool, which made him a dark target against the white landscape. Every other soldier who tried to move had been spotted immediately and forced back down. The Germans owned that hill. Dunham crawled back to the company position and found a white mattress cover. He tore it open and pulled it over his uniform like a robe. Then he started loading. He shoved 12 30-round carbine magazines into every pocket and loop on his uniform. He snagged a dozen Mark II fragmentation grenades onto his belt. He hooked more grenades through his suspenders. He jammed grenades into the buttonholes of his field jacket. When he stood up, he was carrying 72 lbs of ammunition and explosives on top of his rifle. His platoon sergeant looked at him. Dunham didn't explain. He just started crawling up the hill. The first 75 yards took him 18 minutes. He moved during the moments when German fire shifted to other sectors. He pressed himself flat when the MG-42s swept back across his approach. The snow soaked through his mattress cover. His hands went numb. The rifle sling cut into his shoulder from the weight of the grenades. At 75 YD, he was 10 yards from the first machine gun in placement. The timber bunker had been reinforced with logs and positioned to give interlocking fire with the other 2 positions. 3 Germans manned the gun. 1 fed the belt, 1 fired, 1 scanned for targets. If you want to see how Dunham's mattress cover camouflage turned out, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Dunham. Dunham rose to his feet and charged. The Germans spotted the movement. The machine gunner swung the barrel toward him. At 6 yards, the gun opened fire. Rounds tore through Dunham's white robe. Then a rifle bullet caught him across the back, carving a 10-in gash from his left shoulder blade to his spine. The impact spun him completely around and threw him 15 yards back down the hill into the snow. He landed face down. Blood poured from the wound, soaking through the mattress cover and staining the white fabric bright red against the snow. The pain was excruciating. He could feel the wound pulling open with every breath. For 5 seconds, he didn't move. Then a German egg grenade landed in the snow 2 FT from his head. Dunham kicked it away with his boot. It exploded 5 yards down slope, close enough that the concussion lifted him off the ground. And Russell Dunham got back on his feet. He came up the hill firing. His M1 carbine was still loaded with 28 rounds. The German machine gunner swung the MG-42 back toward him, but Dunham was already inside the gun's minimum traverse arc. At 4 yards, he fired a 3-round burst into the gunner's chest. The assistant gunner reached for his rifle. Dunham shot him twice. Both Germans dropped. The third crew member, the ammunition feeder, threw his hands up and started shouting in German. Dunham's carbine was empty, 30 rounds gone in 18 seconds. He slung the rifle, grabbed the German by the collar of his felled growcoat, and hauled him out of the timber emplacement. Then he shoved him down the hill toward the American lines. The German half ran, half fell through the snow. Dunham's platoon would take him for interrogation. Blood was running down Dunham's back in steady streams now. The bullet wound had torn through muscle and tissue, but missed his spine by less than 2 in. Every movement pulled the gash wider. The white mattress cover was soaked red from his shoulders to his waist. Against the snow, he looked like a flag. The second machine gun position was 50 yards uphill and to the right. The Germans manning that gun had watched Dunham take out the first nest. They knew he was coming. They'd adjusted their field of fire to cover the approach. Dunham could see the timber logs of their imp placement and the dark shape of the barrel tracking across the slope. He reloaded the carbine with a fresh 30-round magazine, 11 magazines left, 10 grenades remaining. He started moving. The Germans opened fire at 40 yards. Rounds snapped past his head and kicked up geysers of snow around his boots. Dunham went down and crawled. The pain in his back was so intense he had to stop every few yards to keep from blacking out. He could feel blood pooling inside his uniform. His hands were shaking from blood loss and cold, but he kept crawling. At 25 YD from the second imp placement, he rose to one knee and pulled 2 Mark II grenades from his belt. He yanked both pins, counted 2 seconds, and hurled them in a high arc toward the timber bunker. The Germans saw them coming. One of them screamed. Both grenades detonated inside the emplacement within half a second of each other. The combined blast threw logs and equipment out of the position. The machine gun went silent. Dunham moved forward. Carbine raised. Smoke poured from the shattered imp placement. He could see body parts in the snow. The entire 3-man crew had been killed by the grenades. He didn't stop. He turned his attention downslope to the supporting riflemen who'd been dug into foxholes around the machine gun position. 6 German infantry were scrambling out of their holes trying to get clear. Dunham fired into them from 15 yards. He went through another full magazine, shooting at every shape that moved. He hit 3. The others broke and ran up the hill away from the American advance. Dunham let them go. He had 1 target left. The third machine gun was 65 YDs further up the slope. It was the highest position, the one with the best field of fire over the entire American advance. The Germans there had been watching Dunham's assault for the last 12 minutes. They knew exactly where he was. They knew he was wounded. They knew his white coat was now blood-red and visible against the snow from 200 YD. And they had him in their sights. Dunham looked up the hill. The barrel of the MG-42 was aimed directly at him. Rifle grenades started exploding in the snow 10 yards from his position. The concussions knocked him sideways. He hit the ground as machine gun fire tore through the air where he'd been standing. He was out in the open, no cover. The blood trail behind him, in the snow, looked like a road. And the Germans on top of the hill weren't going to miss again. Dunham crawled. The third machine gun position was dug into a cluster of timber 40 yards ahead and 30 FT higher in elevation. The Germans had reinforced it with sandbags and positioned it to cover the entire southern approach to Hill 616. Every few seconds, the MG-42 would fire a burst, walking rounds across the snow, searching for him. He moved during the gaps between bursts. 5 yards. Stop. Wait for the gun to traverse. 3 more yards. The snow was so cold it burned his hands. The wound in his back had gone from sharp pain to a deep grinding ache that radiated through his entire torso. He'd lost enough blood that his vision was starting to tunnel at the edges, but he still had 9 magazines and 8 grenades. At 40 yards from the third position, a rifle grenade exploded 6 YD to his left. The blast threw snow and frozen dirt across his back, and the impact from the shrapnel felt like being kicked by a horse. He didn't know if he'd been hit again. He couldn't tell any more. Everything hurt. He kept crawling. 30 yards, 25. The machine gun fire was getting more accurate. The Germans could see him now, even against the snow. The blood had soaked through the entire mattress cover. He was leaving a red trail that pointed directly to his position like an arrow. 20 yard, 15. At 15 YD, Dunham stopped crawling and gathered his legs under him. He had to time this perfectly. The MG-42 fired in bursts of 8 to 12 rounds, then paused for 2 to 3 seconds while the gunner readjusted his aim. Dunham counted. Burst 1, 2, 3. He lunged to his feet and staggered forward. The Germans saw him immediately. The machine gunner swung the barrel, but Dunham was already moving, already pulling grenades from his belt. He had 2 marks in his hands, pins pulled. At 10 yards, he threw them both. The first grenade hit the sandbags and bounced into the imp. Placement. The second went through the narrow firing slit. Dunham dove flat as both grenades detonated. The blast was massive. Sandbags flew apart. Timber logs cracked and splintered. The machine gun barrel was blown sideways off its mount. Dunham pushed himself up. Smoke poured from the shattered position. He moved forward with his carbine raised, scanning for movement. All 3 crew members were down. One was still moving, trying to reach for a rifle. Dunham shot him once. The Germans stopped moving. Then he heard boots crunching in snow behind him. Dunham spun around. A German rifleman had come up from one of the support foxholes maybe 20 feet away. The German raised his Carabiner 98 rifle and fired at point-blank range. The bullet missed Dunham's head by 3 in. Dunham fired back. His first round hit the German in the throat. His second hit center mass. The German fell backward into the snow and didn't move. Dunham stood on the hilltop, breathing hard. His carbine was empty again. He'd fired 175 rounds. He'd thrown 11 grenades. 3 machine gun positions were destroyed. 9 Germans were dead. 7 more were wounded. 2 had been taken prisoner, and his platoon was no longer pinned down. Below him, he could see Company I advancing up the slope. His brother Ralph was among them, moving with second squad. The Germans were falling back to secondary positions further up the ridge. The attack was succeeding. Hills 616 would be in American hands by nightfall. Dunham looked down at his uniform. The white mattress cover was completely red now, saturated with blood from the neck down to his knees. He could feel the wound in his back pulling apart with every breath. The pain was so intense he couldn't think straight. His hands were shaking uncontrollably from shock and blood loss, but he'd done it. 120 soldiers from Company I had been pinned in that valley. Without his assault, they would have been slaughtered by artillery within the hour. Now they were moving. Now they were fighting. Now they had a chance. Dunham sat down in the snow and waited for the medics to reach him. He didn't think he was going to die. Not today. The medics reached Dunham 8 minutes after he sat down. They cut away the blood-soaked mattress cover and opened his field jacket to assess the wound. The bullet had carved a gash, 10 in long and 2 in deep, across his back running from his left shoulder blade, down toward his spine. The medics could see muscle tissue and exposed bone. They packed the wound with sulfur powder and wrapped it with compression bandages. Then they gave him a shot of morphine and tagged him for evacuation. Dunham refused to leave. He walked back down the hill with Company I carrying his empty carbine. By the time they reached the battalion aid station at 1800 hours, he'd lost enough blood that he collapsed at the entrance. The battalion surgeon examined him. and immediately ordered him to the rear for surgery. The wound needed stitches, debridement, and at least 2 weeks of recovery before he could return to combat operations. Dunham spent 4 days at the division clearing station. The surgeons cleaned the wound and closed it with 43 stitches. They told him the bullet had missed his spinal cord by less than 2 in. If the angle had been slightly different, he would have been paralyzed from the waist down. If the gash had been 1 in deeper, it would have severed his spine completely. But the wound was clean. No major nerve damage, no infection. He would heal. On January 13th, 5 days after the assault on Hill 616, Dunham was released from the clearing station and sent to a rest area 20 mi behind the front lines. The 3rd Infantry Division had been fighting continuously since landing in southern France in August 1944. The division had pushed through the Vosges Mountains, fought through Strasbourg, and was now engaged in Operation Nordwind, the last major German offensive on the Western Front. The casualties had been catastrophic. In December alone, the division had lost 863 men killed and 3,200 wounded. Every rifle company was operating at 60% strength. The replacement pipeline couldn't keep up with the losses. Men were being pushed back into combat before their wounds fully healed because there was nobody else to fill the line. Dunham's wound was still seeping through the bandages. The stitches pulled. Every time he moved. The doctors had told him he needed 3 more weeks of recovery before returning to duty. But on January 18th, 10 days after Hill 616, he walked into the Company I command post and reported for duty. His wound wasn't healed. The stitches were still in, but 2nd Platoon was down to 18 men, and they needed every rifle they could get. The company commander looked at Dunham's medical file, looked at Dunham, and assigned him back to his squad. No questions asked. They were moving north to Holzwehr, a small town 15 km from the German border. Intelligence reported heavy German armor in the area. Panzer units from the 19th Army were conducting spoiling attacks to delay the American advance. Company Y would be holding a defensive position on the southern edge of town. Dunham rejoined his platoon on January 20th. His brother Ralph was still with 2nd Squad, still carrying the same Browning automatic rifle he'd used since North Africa. They didn't talk about Hill 616. There was nothing to say. Everyone in the company knew what had happened. General Patch himself had visited the battalion on January 16th and asked to meet Dunham. The general had shaken his hand and said his actions had saved the lives of 120 men who would have been killed by artillery if the machine guns hadn't been eliminated. But that was Hill 616. This was Holzwehr. Different fight, different stakes. The 3rd Infantry Division was exhausted, under strength, and facing German armor with limited anti-tank support. Every position they held was temporary. Every defensive line was one breakthrough away from collapse. And on the morning of January 22nd, 1945, 2nd Platoon would find itself surrounded by German tanks with nowhere to run. Dunham's war was about to get significantly worse. At 0600 on January 22nd, 1945, German tanks appeared on 3 sides of Company I's position in Holtz. Dunham counted 7. Panther tanks and 3 Tiger Is moving through the morning fog, their engines growling like rolling thunder across the frozen fields. The 3rd Infantry Division had no armor support in this sector, no tank destroyers, no artillery within range. 2nd Platoon had 2 bazooka teams and exactly 14 rockets between them. The German attack came from the 19th Army's armored reserve units that had been held back during Operation Nordwind and were now being committed to cut off the American salient pushing toward the Rhine. The Panthers came in from the west, advancing in a staggered line across the open farmland. The Tigers moved up from the south, their 88mm guns already traversing to engage any targets that showed movement. Company 1's position was indefensible. They held a cluster of farm buildings on the southern edge of Holtzwihr, with no cover, no concealment, and no way to stop 7-Tonon tanks with frontal armor 8 in thick. The bazooka teams fired their rockets at maximum range, 2 hit. Both bounced off the Panther's glacis plate without penetrating. The Germans didn't even slow down. At 06:30, the company commander gave the order to surrender. White flags went up from 3 buildings. The German tanks stopped advancing and infantry moved forward to take prisoners. 147 men from Company I walked out with their hands up. The Germans disarmed them, searched them, and formed them into columns for transport to P camps in the rear. Dunham didn't surrender. He slipped out the back of the farmhouse while the Germans were processing prisoners and ran west through a line of bare trees toward a cluster of outbuildings 200 wide away. His back wound had reopened during the night. He could feel blood seeping through the bandages under his uniform, but he wasn't going to spend the rest of the war in a prisoner camp. He reached the outbuildings without being spotted.